Welcome to SSI Meetup. Today we have Christopher Allen with us, who's one of the key thinkers, architects of the self-sovereign identity world. So I'm really happy about this. And today I have a little bit of a long introduction that I usually do for the SSI Meetups we do, because this is a very special webinar we have today. First of all, because it's webinar 51, and it's really like almost 2 years ago that we started with this. And today we have Christopher with us, who's one of the key persons, as I said, for many reasons. One, because I think he's managing and started one of the events that I most like about the identity space, which is Rebooting Web of Trust. We're also doing this in collaboration with the Alianza Blockchain Iberoamérica, Bitcoin Argentina, who are leading in the Iberian ecosystem with the Didi Identity project. We presented last week the Decentralized Digital Identity report for the Ibero-American world, but we also mentioned the very important work that Christopher has been doing in explaining the 10 principles of SSI and what that means. And this is just not a technology, it's much more. And Christopher is also participating in the self-sovereign identity book that we will be publishing hopefully by the end of this year with Manning, where he explains the 10 SSI principles. And it's not only all that, it's also because Christopher will be talking today, but also next week, where we're planning to have another session with him about the Remembrance Day, because SSI technology and identity technology is extremely important and very sensitive, and it can be used for good, but it can also be demolishing and dystopian. And he will be sharing some of that with us today. As some of you know, I have a mixed Spanish-German background, so I know a lot about what happened during the Second World War and how things evolved. But I really had the opportunity to look much deeper into that some years ago when I went to Poland, where we visited the whole of Poland, and I really recommend everyone to do that, because it's a very different thing to learn about this in the school system and then to really see the whole scope and scale all this had. So Christopher will be talking about this, and I really recommend you to join us next week again, where Christopher will be talking for the Remembrance Day at sunset, and we'll be sharing this at the end of this presentation with us too. So all this makes this webinar very, very special. So it's a pleasure to have Christopher with us today. For everyone else who hasn't been able to join us before, in the next slide, I'm going to briefly explain what SSI Meetup is about. So our objective here is to empower global SSI communities. For this reason, this is completely open. You will be able to reuse the material with the Creative Commons by Share Alike license, which basically means you have to give credit back to the person who shared the material, which today is Christopher, together with SSI Meetup. And this has been extremely powerful, because we know people like that have been creating communities going from Korea to other places for SSI, and also using these presentations to learn and share and grow their own communities, or just expand the knowledge around SSI. This is open to everyone, to companies, to individuals, to associations, whatever you want. So we've been doing this now for 2 years, and has been really working very well. And it's extremely important for us that this works in this sense, because as I said before, this is not only technology, it's much more than that. It's extremely powerful, but it can be also extremely damaging used in the wrong way. And it's some of those things that Christopher will be touching upon. If you have any questions about the presentation, during the presentation, please just share the question tool. I'll be sharing those questions with Christopher, and he will then answer them, or we can also have a Q&A at the end of this presentation. And I think this covers all the many things we could be talking about with Christopher. So thank you for joining us today. And without further ado, welcome Christopher at SSI Meetup.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate you inviting me this week. As many of you may have heard, we had originally planned to host another Rebooting Web of Trust in this week in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And I really want to also show my appreciation for the people committed to SSI in Argentina and in the Latin world for helping arrange that. But unfortunately, as we all know, circumstances made that not happen. And then I was also forced to leave early. I was hoping to be meeting, in fact, today with government officials and other SSI community people in Argentina. So, but I appreciate you letting me have this opportunity to share some of the information I had hoped to share this week in Argentina. So my name is Christopher Allen. I'm Executive Director of Blockchain Commons, which is a benefit corporation to support blockchain infrastructure and privacy and other initiatives. Specific to this conversation, I'm co-chair of the W3C Credentials Community Group. I'm one of the original architects of the Decentralized identifier. A lot of you know from this podcast that I'm the author of the Design Principles of Self-Sovereign Identity. Back in the 90s, I was co-author of SSL TLS, so I have a lot of experience with making global international standards. In the blockchain area, I was former principal architect at Blockstream. In the cryptography area, I was former CTO of Certicom and CEO of Consensus Development, and I used to teach in the Sustainable Business program at pincho.edu. My contact information is all on the slide. So today, I really wanted to split our conversation into kind of two parts and intertwine them a little bit, because SSI really has two very important sides. One side is the ideology side, what brought us to this community, what keeps us motivated to address problems, and then there is the specific architectures that we've designed to try to attempt to meet our very laudable goals of self-sovereign identity. So this is important because self-sovereign identity is here to help us reclaim human dignity and authority in a digital world. And it's also this emerging architecture that enables it. And sometimes these are in conflict, sometimes they're in close alignment, but we need to keep them both in mind. I'm going to begin with a little bit on ideology. So first off, self-sovereign identity is based on the principles of enlightenment and the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is the baseline that we started at before we actually began to define self-sovereign identity. And the basic premise is that you should control your own identity in regard to your relationships and interactions with people, organizations, and things. And why is this important? Because we all have this inherent dignity that is independent of our birthplace, our lineage, or any labels, just because we are human beings. And you know, we shouldn't lose that inherent dignity because we're online and you can't see my face right now, or you know, we're all social distancing ourselves at this point. So digital identity today is administered by centralized authorities such as governments, corporations, software platform providers such as Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft. Now, each has a legitimate vested interest in managing people both on and offline. Why? Because they want to enforce a social contract between the citizens, between employees, between trade online and services. And they also want to lock out other authorities from changing or profiting from those social contracts. So there is a vested interest in this area. However, it's beginning to fail us. Our relationships with authorities are changing. We're more and more part of a global civil society. You know, we're all part of networks. I'm in the network of my neighborhood. I'm in the network of my city within that neighborhood, but I'm also, you know, nearby active in San Francisco, which is not my neighborhood. These borders and the nature of social contracts are changing. We have these kind of transnational federations, which many of you are in the EU as an example of. We're in nation states. We're in regional states, Wyoming, Scotland, the Swiss cantons. We may also be in indigenous, tribal, and ethnic areas. We could be in a First Nation. We can be in a non-recognized state like Kurdistan. We are also, in a sense, part of the city-states megagopoly, London, SF Bay Area, Boswash. And corporations and employment are crossing these borders too. Now, all these parties, the nations, the tribes, the regional states are in the process of renegotiating what is the nature of their sovereignty. That's why we're seeing these movements, Brexit, Catalan, Taiwan, etc. So the problem that we are encountering now is that authorities are ignoring the voice of ordinary people in this renegotiation. But the relative risks to individuals are greater. A corporation, a nation state, even my neighborhood can suffer a lot more harm and recover from that and be resilient to that than an individual can. So we need, as individuals, a voice as we renegotiate what it means to be human in the digital world, thus self-sovereign identity. So I originally wrote about this almost 5 years ago in The Path to Self-Sovereign Identity, where we were heading out to our second Rebooting Web of Trust at the United Nations in conjunction with the ID 2020 Summit. And that was really the first place where the movement was called self-sovereign identity. And this term picked up very, very quickly, partly because I wrote these 10 principles of self-sovereign identity. Existence, users have an independent existence. They're never wholly digital. Control, users must control their identities. Privacy or celebrity as they prefer. People need to have access to their own data, no gatekeepers, nothing hidden. People need transparency to understand how systems and algorithms work. They need persistence in identities as long as the user wishes. They need portability. The information that is under the control of the user needs to be able to be moved from place to place under their control. We need interoperability so that when it arrives at the other place, we can use it. We need consent. Users must participate in how their identity information is used. We really want to minimize identification and identity to be for the business purposes. And finally, we must protect the rights of the individual against the powerful. Now, there's a lot more details on all of these. I encourage you to read the original document. I'm not going to go into all 10 of these, but just to give you a flavor of some of the depth of some of these, let's start with existence. So as I said a minute ago, users have an independent existence. They're never wholly digital. So why do we say that? The first principle of self-sovereign identity is that human beings exist independent of our digital representations. Our physical existence is our most fundamental fact, and the control over ourself is our most fundamental freedom, our unalienable rights. This should also be true in the digital world. This is why we have things like the Bill of Rights. This is why we have things like the Declaration of Human Rights in the United Nations. We have these control over ourself and our fundamental unalienable rights in the physical world through those, but those have not been represented in our digital world. So human dignity demands that individuals be treated with respect no matter where they interact, face-to-face or online, because without that, we become nothing but data in the machine. Entries in a ledger that can be managed, problems to be solved, and we become digital serfs, but we are not. So moving on to the second principle, control. Users must control their identities, privacy, or celebrity as they prefer. So the second principle of self-sovereign identity is that you are the ultimate moral authority on your identity. You should always be able to refer to it, update it, or even potentially hide it. Why? Because as our digital representations become more and more how we engage in the society, a free society demands that we be given a voice in deciding how those representations are created and used. Not just because we own the data, but because as individual human beings, we are the only valid source of that moral authority. This is particularly important today as more of us are participating online because of social distancing and other measures, our digital personalities, our digital voice is becoming an essential part of how we interact with the world. We need to have that moral authority over how our representations are online. We need to have control over our digital selves just as we do over our physical selves. Now, this is not perfect control. It's not complete. As children, we learn appropriate boundaries of what control means. That toy is that the other person has is not my toy. But as we grow, as we learn, and as adults, we are expected to understand these appropriate boundaries. Well, we need the same thing online. Self-sovereignty doesn't mean that you're in complete control, but it does define some borders by which you can make decisions about and outside of which you can negotiate with others as peers, not as a petitioner. There's a legal aphorism in the US, which is the right to swing your arm ends just where the other man's nose begins. I think that's an important aspect of the limits of self-sovereignty. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the other 8 principles in this level of detail, but I did want to bring up one important area. Identity isn't property. So the challenge we have is that our physical paradigms of control have a lot to do about possession and being able to give somebody half of something or whatever. But human rights in the real world are universal and indivisible. They're inalienable. They attach to us and they can't be divided. They can't be surrendered. So using property law paradigms for data ownership loses sight of these intrinsic rights that may attach to our data. Just because something is property-like does not mean that it is. I think Elizabeth Reinaris did this best. This is a quote from her on this issue. When I originally wrote the self-sovereign identity principles, we were still really kind of teasing this out, and now the community is largely being careful every time we see the word own to not use it, and instead use the idea of the ability for a person to control their identity as we do our physical selves. I don't think control is a perfect word either, but it's better than own, because own ends up having all of these sort of property law aspects of it. So again, I encourage you to look at the 10 principles of self-sovereign identity. There is a movement this year to revise the 10 principles because we're coming up on 5 years. There's a GitHub repository where we've begun discussing and accepting pull requests on updating the 10 principles, for instance, to remove any things around ownership. Referring to people as users is probably not the right way to do things. So if you are a wordsmith and really care about this stuff, I encourage you to participate in some future events online where we try to work on updating a 2020 version of the 10 principles of self-sovereign identity. I do want to be careful here. These principles really do attempt to ensure the user is at the heart of self-sovereign identity. But even if you are using the principles, identity is a two-edged sword. It is useful for both beneficial and maleficent purposes. We can have a really great self-sovereign identity principled thing and still have problems, because there is this need to balance fairness and accountability in support of the commons against the need to prevent human rights abuses and the right to be able to freely associate. So, I mean, an example of this is today. We're finding that governments and other parties have a very legitimate need for information about populations and health outcomes and other information. And this is going to help us all. But this will be in conflict with our, some of our individual rights, and some of these data that is collected could be used against us in the future. So I generally try to have this rubric for how to decide what happens when these needs conflict. So we want to preserve the freedom and rights of the individuals over that of the group. Now, that's not an absolute that's not an absolute thing. A group is always over, but when they're equal, when the issues are really clearly in conflict, we can have one or the other. I will prefer to have the freedom and rights of the individual. An example of this is there are some people talking about using location data from phones to basically use as evidence to arrest them for violating quarantines and things of that nature. And I think that it's absolutely essential that we find ways to anonymize information to be able to give healthcare providers and governments the ability to understand what is going on in their population. But I think the risk is that even though it may be good today to enforce a quarantine against an individual, crises have a tendency to live on forever, and we risk a lot of harm in the future. And I'll talk about the kinds of harm in a few minutes. So this leads us to architecture. That was the ideology, or beginning on ideology. So how in heck do we achieve this? We had this real problem in 5 years ago when we did the first rebooting of where do we begin? Where do we puzzle through to how to solve some of these identity problems? How do we create this self-sovereign identity ideology? So what we discovered was an early sweet spot was credentials. So credentials are evidence of authority and status and privileges. Some classic ones are driver's licenses, education, and professional credentials. But they can also be things like, I really liked working with Kim Hamilton on a standard, and I would recommend to others that she's a great person to collaborate with. That's in a sense a peer credential. But what is a credential? Well, one thing is it's related to the subject. So, it uses a photo, a name, or some kind of identification. Many people know what I mean when I say the subject of my claim about Kim is who she is. They don't need to know a whole lot of other stuff because they've met her here on this webcast. There's information related to me, which is as the issuer, but could be a city government, could be a national agency or a certification body. There's evidence related to how the credential was derived. Well, in the case of Kim, we can actually show some of the standards that Kim and I worked on together, and we can have some information related to the usage. You can look at the issues and discussions, and who the different people are. So a digital credential represents all the same information, but it adds things that the physical credentials could not. It's tamper-proof. Holders can present presentations with multiple credentials, and they can be transmitted. Now, why is this important? This allows us to be able to have trust at a distance. So in the original digital credential ecosystem, going back to SSL days and TLS, et cetera, we had issuers who issued credentials. Say a certificate authority issued a credential to say that this is a valid website. We have a holder, which was the individual browser that had that certificate, and then we actually had somebody verify that. So this is a very traditional model, but it had problems. So first off, we have inappropriate use and overuse of identifiers. For instance, in the United States, Social Security numbers really aren't supposed to be used for identifiers. They're solely supposed to be for the use of the IRS to be able to receive and track funds that you give them for tax returns. We're discovering the limitations of names and passwords. These days, an 8-word password is insufficient. I can probably break most 8-character passwords, for several thousands of dollars of AWS time. So if you've got something more powerful, more valuable than several $1,000s, then don't use an 8-character password. But then we have to memorize these passwords. So we've got lots of issues there. We also have personal data and reputation locked by big corps. We have those big corps collecting and selling that without necessarily, having our best interest in mind. And then, of course, anytime you have a centralized authority, credentials and private information can be stolen. As example, the Yahoo and Expedia and many other thefts in the past. We also have some legitimate needs. We need to be able to give our spouse the ability to use our bank account, or allow a CPA to be able to give a bookkeeper access to some accounts. And then finally, service later can shut down. You become a digital refugee. I taught at an MBA program that was certified and had all the rights to be able to grant diplomas. Well, that organization ended up being changing its name, and then it was acquired by another organization or whatever. So I am no longer in a position to be able to make statements as to this by students, and it's probably hard for a lot of my students to be able to get claims regarding the MBA that they were granted. How do we do that when services shut down, or when nations change, things like what's happening in Brexit? So another problem with traditional identity systems, digital identity systems, is that you have many identities, and they all can have different contexts. Family, which includes your spouse's family, your ex's family, blended families. We have friends from different eras of our life. Different identity of who I was and how I represented myself in high school, college, in a different career. I know I'm involved with many different communities. If you were here a little early for my talk, I played a little bit on a handpan. I have a very different community there, and the standards and the language and how we talk and work together is different. And then finally, we have many institutions: employers, schools, residencies, citizenship. These all contexts cause problems. They all have identifiers, but everybody wants to try to combine them in ways that don't necessarily work for you. We have friends work in institutions, we have society. So what happened was these big institutions basically came in particular the GAFA online, said, hey, we'll solve this problem for you. We will manage your context and identity, but it ends up becoming a mess. Too many contexts, too many identities, and it becomes a real mess. So the DID community, the self-sovereign identity community, basically said the root of the problem was the identifier itself. This thing that you have in your driver's license, your social security number, et cetera. They're all leased to you by your DNS provider, or from your phone company, or government, et cetera. And these cause lots of problems of cost, data portability, privacy, security, et cetera. So this is the narrow place that we cited to start. It's not the only place self-sovereign identity needs to be thought about, but this was a nice beginning spot. So in the old digital identifier system, we have the issue holders and the verifiers basically get everything from the centralized name system, but that makes it difficult to do many identifiers, and makes it difficult to be portable, et cetera. We want to protect things with cryptography. We want to enable privacy and data portability. So what we created was something called a decentralized identifier, or DID, that's globally unique, highly verifiable, cryptographically verifiable, but important point is no central authority. So here's an example of one at the bottom of the screen. In this model, issuers and holders and verifiers also exist, but instead the decentralized identifiers are controlled by issuers, subjects, holders, verifiers. And then we use blockchain or DHT technology to decentralize this. An example of one is here. We have DID, the high-level standard. BTCR is one method, what is known as a DID method. This particular one uses Bitcoin, but it could be Ethereum, it could be a wide variety. I think there's over 40 registered at this point. And then the actual identifier, which would be specific and different depending on which method. So in this particular case, it refers to a Bitcoin transaction. This allows us to have decentralized identifiers for individuals, but we can also do this for organizations and for things, phones, IoT devices, at-home tools. These are registered on a decentralized network, and they're created and managed via wallet applications. Here is a list of some of the ones that have been registered. These are some of the bigger, the older ones, but there is a lot more registered. So we have the Bitcoin reference, Blockstack, and Ethereum, ERC, IPFS, the sovereign ecosystem, the Veris One ecosystem, et cetera, all have DIDs. So in this world, we basically have all the parallels. Instead of using a centralized identifier, we use a decentralized on this driver's license. We have the credential metadata, which says that it expires at a particular time. We have the claims, which is this is a driver's license. And we have an issuer signature that allows for you to know that this hasn't been counterfeited. And we have a verification process with some basic biometrics that allow us to know that the holder of this particular credential is the subject of this credential. There are lots of organizations committed to DIDs. This list is out of date by at least a year, but you can see there's a huge number of companies, Microsoft, IBM, large organizations that are working together through things like Hyperledger, through Sovereign. We have banks, we have governments, and more. So specific around governments, there's increasing government support. The particular areas that it seems to be doing piloting the best in governments is around cross-border issues, because when you cross a border, say between US and Canada, they're not necessarily going to agree on identifiers. So allowing for multiple identifiers in a decentralized way solves supply chain problems, counterfeit goods can be addressed. In particular, the Department of Homeland Security in the United States has said in Congress that they are planning on having requiring decentralized identifiers and verifiable claims in future projects. And but they are requiring these to be open, royalty-free, and free to implement. We're seeing some similar work being done in Europe with the European Self-Sovereign Identity Framework, also in Canada with the Canadian Trust Framework. So this is really, moving forward. But talking about this government-oriented identity, I really need to speak to these two major architecture tracks happening right now. So one is less identity. So less identity is the acronym for legally enabled self-sovereign identity. And this was coined by Tim Bouma. One thing I like about it is that the intent is to do in many ways less than what we did before. I mean, principle number 9 is minimization. We want to do only that which is necessary to do the task and protect the people involved and to manage the risk as necessary. So it's minimum disclosure, necessary proofs, and we want legal definitions behind it and legal consequences for that. The other track is the trustless identity track. Now, I don't personally like the word trustless very much. I prefer the term trust minimized, but like many terms, we have to accept it. The characterization of trustless identity is to support anonymity, web of trust, support censorship resistance, and in particular defend human rights versus powerful actors, whether or not the powerful actors are nation states, multinational corporations, mafias, or even very rich individuals with lots of money to spend to attack others. So in less identity, Tim said, I want my identity to be digital, to be good and better, and in the end, I want my identity to be less than the real. And then I would add to that, less identity is for higher trust environments where there is real world identity verification, trust frameworks for that, and then privacy with accountability and government acceptance. So that's what less identity is. Trustless identity is really around these kinds of problems. 1.1 billion people have no legal identity, millions of stateless refugees. This is a fact today. And it's not, in many ways, not getting better given current events. And then, it's been observed for almost 3,000 years that tyranny can arise out of democracy, and that the most aggravated form of tyranny and slavery can happen out of the most extreme form of liberty. This comes from Plato in the Republic. So we have to be careful. So we have these two different tracks. The less identity track is doing very well. Lots of companies, lots of financial support, increasing government support. Trustless identity, because there's not a business model around it, is going slower. Back to trustless, we desire to balance the need for fairness, accountability, and support of the commons of society against the need to prevent human rights abuse and the right to be able to freely associate. So I talked about this before, and then we really need in trustless identity to err to preserve the freedom rights of the individual. Why do I care about this? So last month was the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. So I went to a very moving ceremony in Amsterdam where, to my surprise, the Netherlands Prime Minister stood up and spoke. Now, I don't speak Dutch, but I was able to get a translation. He was basically, for the first time ever, saying on behalf of the Netherlands government, when authority became a threat, our government agencies failed as guardians of the law and security. And now that the last survivors are still among us, I apologize today on behalf of the government for government actions then. So this was Mark Rutte, the Netherlands Prime Minister. And this was a very important moment. I saw people in tears around this because it's been a long time in coming. So what went wrong? He didn't really say why. What went wrong that the government had to apologize? Well, the reason why is that more Jews died as a percentage of population in the Netherlands than in Germany, France, or any other World War II country. And part of the reason historians say this happened is because the Nazis took over civil administration. They had the data. The percentage of Jews in Holland wasn't that much different than other countries, but the Dutch had a few more than the French, but it was a small percentage. But 3/4 of the Dutch Jews were murdered. Why did this happen? Well, part of the reason why it happened was in 1932, J.L. Lentz became head of the National Inspectorate of Population Registers. So he was the head of identity in the Dutch Civil Service. And in the 1930s, much of the world was in the grip of the Great Depression. So the Netherlands and the Dutch Civil Service really did a fabulous job ensuring that citizens had access to basic services, the ability to get their needs met and not suffer some of the greatest harms of the Depression. In particular, Lentz was given the task of promoting more unity in population registers. So in 1936, he helped establish a decree that every resident in the Netherlands must have a personal identity card located in the civil archives, and that these cards must all be controlled from a single office in each region. J.L. Lentz won a royal award from the Queen of the Netherlands for success in these efforts in 1936. Decentralized archives were one of the first targets captured by the Nazis, and they were considered a very valuable asset. Almost immediately after the capitulation, Lentz was asked by the Nazis to create a very difficult to forge national identity card. He literally wrote the book on personal identity, and in particular, I was fascinated by his techniques of doing a proof of inclusion in the population ledger in 1940. So this became a real problem for Jewish and homosexuals and gypsies and other people that the Nazis didn't like. So the resistance in the Netherlands was very, very active. They started forging these identity cards. They were very difficult to forge. The problem was that even when they forged them successfully, they could be easily compared against the records in the civil registry. All they had to do was hold the individual for a brief amount of time, take their card to the registry, and they could do that proof of inclusion in a civil registry, and in a very short time determine that that counterfeit card did not have the J Jewish sign on it, or had some other information that was incorrect. So they basically recruited civil servants that were willing to falsify records in the civil registry so that they could match up with the forged identification cards. They had to give the Jewish person a forged identification card, but they also had to go find their card in the registry and change it. This became kind of a race between these two organizations, the Nazis and the resistance. What they ultimately, the resistance wasn't able to do this fast enough, and what the Dutch resistance did on the, excuse me, it's not the 28th, it's the 27th of March, was try to burn down the civil registry. They only, unfortunately, destroyed 15% of the records. Now, how does this compare to France? In France, the Vichy government was also supporting the Nazi deportation of the Jews and other undesirables. However, in 1942, the Vichy government refused to continue to arrest Jews and send them for deportation. The Nazis did not control the civil archives, nor were they as centralized as they were in the Netherlands. So as a consequence, only 23% of the Jews died in France, whereas 75% of the Jews died in the Netherlands, all because of this centralization. So this has become a living history. After last month's Holocaust memorial, I had a lunch with a child of two survivors. He was the one who told me about what the Prime Minister said, and he was very moved. His mother had been rounded up using this data in a razzia. So basically there'd be protests by resistance members in the public or strikes, and the Nazis would basically just, pull out the box and say, these people should all be arrested and rounded up and deported. And his mother was one of those. So very specifically from the data in the civil archives. His father fled and was hidden by the resistance in Utrecht, but was ultimately betrayed. And according to the survivor's son, they believe that the Nazis used civil data as a sort of early social network analysis. They basically said, well, who was the neighbor of this missing person? Who was the friend of this missing person, et cetera, and were able to track him down in spite of the fact he was in a totally different city and had been hidden away. So the lessons for today: despite the trust we have in the government today, we will never know what may happen tomorrow. Centralized architectures and immutable proofs can be used for both good and for evil. So this is, very interesting from the Netherlands living history, because the survivors of World War II and the Netherlands government have been very supportive of human rights advocacy. I've heard from many people that GDPR has been, led by many people in the Netherlands government. And I think this is why self-sovereign identity has been on their agenda in the last year to address. But remembrance is still needed. It's been 75 years since the Holocaust. The passing of the old generations and fake news are fading these memories. I had older people in the government, after I did the original talk, say, basically say that they'd heard these stories, and it was part of the reason why they were involved in these digital identity practices and GDPR and privacy and whatever, but they felt they couldn't tell the story because the government had not officially acknowledged their role in this, and they really felt it was great to hear this story. But I also had younger civil service and civil society people go, I never heard this story, or I was taught this in school, but I didn't really understand what happened until I presented this original version's presentation. So a question for the world is, how can we be heroes? Where are the false identification cards and fake baptismal certificates in a world of immutable records? How can honest to goodness heroes fake an ID in a world where IDs can't be faked? This is a quote from Thomas Rush. So we need trustless solutions in addition to the legal enabled sovereign identity solutions. Why? Because nationalism, tribalism, and xenophobia are on the rise. We see examples of this in Russia with Putin, Brazil with Bolsonaro, Great Britain, Turkey, Erdogan, in USA, and more. This normalization of xenophobia encourages violations of human rights. We've seen academics, critics, journalists, Muslims, transgender people all be targeted using these things. As we're getting more and more technical capability for facial recognition, these are becoming adopted worldwide. If you've been traveling like I have in the last week, I'm having my photo face at every single border. There's concerns that we might see this just leaving our neighborhoods. These new dangers require new ways to protect human rights. Now, I'm not saying trustless is the only form of self-sovereign identity. The Netherlands today is a high trust society. The citizen and the government, trust each other. This is good. This is what the relationship is and should be between a government and its citizens. But this isn't true elsewhere, and it isn't true forever. Less identity is where the money is. But don't forget that self-sovereign has deep trustless roots that are important, even though all the major advancements in the last 2 years have been projects for commerce or are recognized as legal by governments. But please, as these standards emerge, don't lock out the trustless solutions. They serve different needs, not served by legally enabled self-sovereign identity. So I have a specific action. So next week is the 27th of March. And I would like to see the self-sovereign and the larger identity community have a moment of silence, what I'm calling a forward remembrance, a for remembrance. Now that's not a real English word, but I like it, a for remembrance. What are we remembering? We're remembering sculptor Gerrit van der Veen, who forged 80,000 civil records, and the author painter William Arondis and 11 others who were found guilty of attempting to destroy the civil archives and thus were executed by the Nazis. Here's the memorial plaque on the old civil archives. We want to salute all those who died to protect the defenseless in World War II, who eased suffering in genocides past and fought discrimination and totalitarianism. But we also want to remember forward. For those on the front today about these issues. We want to remember for the protesters in Hong Kong, those that are trying to discover details about the Xi'an re-education concentration camps in Western China. I want to share my appreciation of the government of Gambia taking on Burmese Aung San Suu Kyi to court in The Hague to demand protection for the Rohingya. I want to salute those who are protecting immigrant children on the US border or are protecting us against Cambridge Analytica-like attacks this year in elections. And of course, all those who are protecting minority communities such as gays, transsexuals, and more. We want to salute those who defend the vulnerable. So I would like to suggest that on the 27th of March, 7 days from now, during sunset in Amsterdam, which takes place at 7:06 p.m. Central European Standard Time, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and 10 a.m. Pacific Time, that we have a moment of silence. And there's the tweet that has more details about the remembrance next week. And Alex has generously said that we can use the SSI meetup here to have a discussion and a moment of silence together. next week. So again, my name's Christopher Allen. My information's on the slide, and that's the end of my talk.
Thank you so much, Christopher, for everything, and I think also for giving purpose to everything we're doing, and also to remind everyone the implications it can have for the positive and also for the negative. We have a couple of questions here already. For anyone who has questions, please just join in now. You can use the question tool for your question, and I'm just going to start directly with Adrian, and just please go ahead and ask your questions, and I'll start with Adrian. So Adrian is saying, governance of SSI is one of the key growth factors of SSI adoption. How will governance frameworks evolve, and which implementations do you see on an organizational and technical level with the ecosystem?
Sure. So in the legally enabled sovereign identity area, there are some obvious leaders in the sovereign ecosystem, which includes Hyperledger, Indy, and other efforts. We're seeing that particular platform being applied in places like Canada and other countries. There's also the VERAS-1 ecosystem, which is being used by Homeland Security in the United States and also other authorities. We have a variety of smaller projects, UPort, in things at kind of the city level in places like Zug in Switzerland. There are quite a number of others. I think the second facet of your question is, what is it that we need to do? Well, one thing is, I really hope that governments, as they begin to work on these types of things, are careful and don't lock themselves into one platform. I don't know what the best platform is. Part of the reason why I advocated in the design of DID's methods was that I'm fairly confident that 5 years from now, we will not be using any of the current DID methods. That some of them will change, some of them will evolve, some will disappear, some will learn from their failures. And we need to be able to adapt. So, in my advocacy, both in Wyoming, which is considering a system, and in the Netherlands, I'm saying, pick two at least, and require in your standards that they interoperate. So I think that's something I would like to see, and there's been some acceptance of that by governments, so that they won't be locked into a single vendor or a single architecture. The US government is already requiring that for some of the things that they're talking about in the future. I think a separate issue that's a little bit harder is it's really easy to over-identify, to use security technologies and biometrics and things of that nature, because we don't have a good definition for what digital trust is. People have a tendency to throw in the kitchen sink and say we need it all. We need better frameworks for deciding that that amount of trust and assurance and identity is not required in certain situations and with certain kinds of communities, and that you should do no more identification than what is necessary for the risks in the task. So, don't be asking for fingerprint identification, when you're buying a beer. That should be prohibited, and there should be penalties for, organizations that try to do that. I think there's a lot more we need to do and think about in this area. I hope that answered the question.
Absolutely, thank you. A couple of questions coming in here from Gabriela. She's saying the first one is, will a user be able to delete their identity? How can you be sure it is really deleted if the previous blocks have the data?
Right, so this is one of the things the DID and verifiable credentials community of the W3C are very against, putting personal data on blockchains and other immutable ledgers. That's a bad design. So we need to make sure that those types of things don't happen. But even when we don't put sort of directly personal identifiable data on there, things like hashes and other stuff, we still have to be very careful with. We don't want one hash to rule them all for an individual. We want to keep things separated. We want to keep things minimized. And then in the trustless forms, we're really kind of stretching the limits of how much can we allow for anonymity and decorrelation, and yet allow for group activities and group trust to emerge out of things like web of trust, or proof of unique personhood and things of that nature, which are some of the things that we'll need to perfect in order to do some of the trustless solutions. And I believe that many of these trustless solutions will be useful in the less identity field. So in many cases, a proof of unique personhood in a context, which is one of my kind of goals, is great for things like neighborhoods and other places where having your national identity be linked to your neighborhood identity is not required, and in fact could be abused. So I think there are ways that even in less identity they can use some of these more trustless forms in what they do.
Great. Gabriel is also asking, blockchain has a problem of scale. Is that solved?
So one of the reasons why I really pushed for multiple DID methods was exactly to address this problem. But also, I want to add the word appropriate scale. So for instance, I know the BTCR, which is a Bitcoin reference DID method that I'm one of the designers of, we're not planning to scale. There's some very specific things that Bitcoin offers that other blockchains do not. But we also have to accept that scaling will be limited. And so we really, are trying to choose problems that are appropriate for that scale. Whereas, say, Microsoft is working on a DID method that, in theory, can scale to hundreds of millions. So, there is a range between there of possibilities and scale that we still have to discover and prove. But I think, between these things, we're discovering what is the appropriate scale of a DID method for a particular task. And I don't believe that there will, ultimately be one DID method that wins in the end. I think there will be half a dozen or so DID methods 5 or 10 years from now that will be used for 90 or even 99% of the cases, and they will be very different things for very different purposes. Go ahead.
Great. Maximiliano's asking, hi, you probably don't know IOP.global. We have already implemented a working decentralized identity solution based on the W3C standard. Are you willing to look into our tech stack? And then he's adding, if so, then I would gladly send you our white paper and demo app. Can I connect through email or LinkedIn?
Correct. So I have heard of it before, and there's a lot of people that are involved in implementing DIDs, verifiable credentials, or things close to them in a variety of communities. I have a limited amount of time. I am very encouraging people to become involved with, say, Rebooting Web of Trust, or the W3C Credentials Community Group, or if you can afford to join the W3C or Hyperledger or one of these other organizations, to work together with others. So I'm much more willing to give time to any project if I can show that they're part of the community. So when somebody says, hey, I'm a member of say, the W3C Credentials Community Group, which is free, I am posting issues and I'm asking questions and I'm, learning how this works, I'm a lot more willing to give you a little time to look at your tech stack and give you advice, etc. I mean, I'm clearly, I am not working for any particular of these platforms. I'm an independent. I try to be very vendor neutral and blockchain agnostic in my work, and I am available as a professional advisor for a fee on these types of things. But I will, if you're part of one of the communities, Rebooting, W3C CCG, DID Working Group, one of the major platform communities, and you've got some questions, I'll be glad to take a look. But that's really kind of, I have to draw a line. Participate, be part of the community, show that you're contributing, even if it's just with smart questions, like, what in the heck are you doing and why did you do it that way, is a useful thing.
I fully agree with that. And Maximiliano is adding where to join the W3C community. Please just check it out in Google. You can see if you can join the W3C DID group or the W3C. Can you join that too?
Yeah, so if you just look up W3C and then the initial CCG, you will see two places. One is on GitHub, so it's W3C-CCG.github.io. We'll go to a homepage that has lots of different details. The advantage of the Credentials community group is that it's free and we have weekly meetings. You do need to agree to a common IP policy, but there's no charge to join that group and be involved in that community. We have meetings every Tuesday. It's at noon Eastern and 9 a.m. Pacific, and I think 5 or 6. I always forget with time zone changes in Europe. We're working on trying to figure out how to connect to the Asian community because those times aren't good for Asia. The Rebooting Web of Trust is a twice a year event, but obviously we canceled one this week. We're working on trying to figure out how we can do what Rebooting does, which is actually incubate and create together to be able to do more of that online. And then the current hope is that we'd be able to be in the Netherlands in September if travel and COVID restrictions are eased in September. So that's an annual event, and then join the mailing list if you want to participate in some virtual events that we're going to be experimenting with over the next couple of months. The W3C is also runs more formal organizations, of which the DID Working Group is one, and in order to be able to participate in those, you have to be a full member of the W3C, which is I think it's like $5,000, $6,000 a year for no, it's less than that for a startup, but it's it's not free. Hyperledger, Vera's one, these other platforms have their own. Most of them are free and to be able to participate, but in order to do certain types of things, you may have to be a member. So those are the leaders right now. There are organizations like Blockstack and a variety of other what I would say more on the edge platform communities that are doing interesting work as well. And I hope that they'll join us in these standards as they become more mature.
Great. We have Adrian asking, should I change my job from growth hacker to ethical identity educator in lack of a better name?
Yeah, well, I think growth hacker is I think the ethical identity educator certainly is a lot more clear. I'm not sure what a growth hacker is.
Okay. Ignacio's asking, are you following the EPSI European SSI framework project and alignment of SSI with the IDOS regulation?
Yes, I am. That's part of why I was in the Netherlands in January, early February, and I know that I'll be continuing to talk about a variety of things there with that community over the next 6-8 months. Some of these types of things are hard to address because many of the regulators basically got their requirements from centralized identity systems. So trying to reconcile the ability to take advantage of the legacy identity systems and their work and not have it affect the principles of self-sovereign identity is sometimes a challenge, but I think it's doable. And then in some cases, there's a willingness to change some of the regulations that are maybe too tight to prescribe a particular solution rather than necessarily the best solution. So we'll see how that shakes out, over the next year.
Cool. I have a couple of questions more for myself. If anyone else would like to jump in, please do that. You mentioned this briefly, but I think given the very special circumstances we are in or unique historic moment we are in right now with COVID-19, what do you think are the things we should be paying attention to in terms of solutions and requirements that will be developed right now to track people that are sick or infected and so on, and how that relates to SSI? I mean, what would be your general headlines about things we should be paying attention to in terms of privacy and SSI?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that's clearly emerging in the community is a need for something called personal data stores, which is basically the ability to have your personal data and other information, whether or not it's photos or health records or whatever, in the cloud, controlled by your keys, and allows you to offer others the capability to read them, whether or not it's your grandma to be able to your grandma to be able to see your children's photographs, or to your healthcare provider to give you a diagnosis about your symptoms. I think that's emerging, and there are a number of interesting groups that are kind of gathering at the W3C community group, and also the DIF, Decentralized Identity Forum. I should have mentioned them earlier in my list of organizations. And we're kind of merging our efforts to do some stuff around personal data stores. But I think that the next step is, how do we safely aggregate as groups our data, in particular healthcare data or fitness data or other things in a way that is as safe as possible. Clearly, de-anonymization is easier than we would like it to be, but what can we do to try to make these things safer so that we can share health information as a group, as a neighborhood, as a people interested in an area like fitness or art. How do we do so as groups in a safe way? And I think that's not on the agenda high enough right now, given the new circumstances. I think 2 months ago I could say, well, we'll make the personal identity stores this year, and maybe next year we'll work on these group things. But given the need to be able to share healthcare information safely without endangering us in the future if there's regime change or other human rights violations and things of that nature, I think we need to tackle that sooner.
Fantastic. Just two more. I mean, it's one question, but 3 elements to this. I mean, I think it would be really good if you can give some historic background about why you wrote this piece about the 10 principles of SSI, or the path to self-sovereign identity. Also, why you started Rebooting Web of Trust and the Blockchain Commons, just to see a little bit how this evolved over time and how you developed all these different instruments to raise awareness about SSI.
Yeah, so I think a lot of it, I mean, if you go to my roots way back, I created a company in 1988 called Consensus Development, and its goal was to, you know, try to solve big problems, the big gnarly problems, through better collaboration. And I was seeing emerging in the late 80s, sort of, you know, the internet wasn't really big at that point. This is, you know, sort of AOL was actually brand new around that time. And but I was very interested in this sort of comparison of machine consensus and group consensus, and how do you help that happen. Ultimately, in the early 90s, we tried to do some projects here and they failed, and largely because people didn't trust them, or there were economic challenges because of, you know, how do you pay people to fairly when they're collaborating. So I got involved with DigiCash, I got involved with the very early burgeoning cryptography movement, PGP, etc. Ultimately, that led to me becoming, you know, co-author of the TLS standard and leading the SSL TLS community to make that the international standard it is today. There were decisions that we made then that I would say were in the league of trying to prevent centralization. We were very much, you know, did not imagine that the centralization of certificate authorities would happen that the way it did, that many of the other forms of centralization that emerged despite our efforts to try to stop that failed. So, you know, coming into you know, 2014 or so, after working with Bitcoin a bit and some of the newer technologies, et cetera, I was kind of realizing that a lot of our original vision, some of the things we talked about with Web of Trust in the 90s with PGP and DigiCash and you know, 1993, 94, et cetera, were now possible, and we could basically do things with that. But in the meantime, you know, a lot of that history, a lot of that background had been lost. A lot of our motivations and thoughts of how to address these problems, you know, went by the wayside, and a lot of the things that we did became entrenched. Trying to change TLS to just 1.2 to 1.3 was incredibly hard, and it was, you know, in my opinion, 10 years overdue. So, you know, in 2014, I started gathering together leaders in various communities, not just the blockchain community, but general security community, et cetera, to try to, you know, could we meet together in one place and make a difference? How could we actually not just talk about it? And you know, I've been through 10 years of people going, well, you know, if I was doing this, I'd do it this way. I would say instead, no, sit down and let's do it differently. So we started doing that in the first rebooting Web of Trust 5 years ago, and it's been had a huge effect on the dialogue in the industry. Out of rebooting has come things like the decentralized identifier and many of these other technologies and our language about it. But it's just an incubation point to be able to work together. Clearly, in a world where we may be meeting less face-to-face, you know, rebooting will need to, you know, to puzzle through how to do what we do, which is ship stuff, ship white paper, ship proof of concepts, et cetera. We'll have to find more ways to do that than our very effective events with, you know, 50 to 100 people. I'm not saying we're going to stop doing events. There's still real power and trust that happens when you can see somebody face to face and you're working with them across the table. But clearly, we're going to have to not be limited as that the only way to do what we do.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Christopher, for everything. I think it's a real privilege for everyone to be able to listen to you and also give perspective on why all this is important. I'll be working with you offline and preparing this next webinar next week for the remembrance, which I hope everyone will join. I'll try to move it as much as possible in the identity SSI community, so that we can have that and prepare it. So I'll be pinging you. For everyone else, if this is the first time you're joining, just sign up to the newsletter or follow us in the social media channels like Twitter, etc., and all those things. We also have a Telegram channel. We will have, usually we do all these webinars in a sequential way. This time it will be different because we just improvised, and we will be doing this next webinar for the Remembrance Day next Friday. But we have on the 31st of March also a special session with the team from TNO, with Joost and Oscar, who will be presenting the European SSI Framework Labs, which is an initiative from the European Union to develop the European SSI ecosystem, and they're developing a grant system, especially for small and mid-sized enterprises in Europe. So I encourage you, if you're based in Europe or anywhere else in the world, to check that out. But the first one we will be doing is this very important webinar with Christopher next week. And Christopher, I thank you again so much for sharing all this. And we'll talk very soon in preparing the next webinar then.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you everybody for joining.
Yeah.